inshallah, for this Fajr kind of reminder. The topic we're going to be discussing is Surah Luqman. And what we're going to do, inshallah, is go through the general sort of structure of the surah itself, and then a specific set of advice that Luqman gives to his child, and we'll try to derive from it, inshallah, what benefits that we can, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So the surah begins with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saying, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ألف لام ميم تلك آيات الكتاب الحكيم هدى ورحمة للمحسنين الذين يقيمون الصلاة ويؤتون الزكاة وهم بالآخرة هم يوقنون أولئك على هدى من ربهم وأولئك هم المفلحون. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala begins this surah with describing the believers. And He describes the believers as those who establish the prayer, who give in zakat, they believe in the akhirah, and they are upon a guidance from their Lord, and it is they who are guided. And it's important to understand that the believers, with the description here, that they're following a guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is in contrast to those who follow other than that, which we'll see in the very next verse, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمِنَ النَّاسِ مَنْ يَشْتَرِي لهو الحديث ليضل عن سبيل الله بغير علم ويتخذها هزوا أولئك لهم عذاب مهين. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He describes the believers as those who follow a guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then He says, and from the people there are those that purchase, literally, يشتري لهو الحديث, idle speech, to misguide people away from the sabil of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, from the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they take this as something that they make a mockery of the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And for them is a painful, humiliating punishment. And the revelation of this verse, the context of it, as some of the mufassirun, they mention that the Prophet ﷺ would try to call the people of Quraysh towards the Quran and towards understanding the Quran and listening to the commands of the Quran. And there would be some disbelievers who would sort of be on the fence, meaning they're intrigued by the beauty of the verses of the Quran, but the difficulty of maybe the obligations that come after that was still heavy on them. So they were sort of on the fence, but they liked listening to the Quran. So to guide these people, or to misguide these people away from the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, some of the disbelievers of Quraysh, they, in one instance, for example, an individual, he brought a girl who would sing. And he would get her, and he would invite the other disbelievers to come and attend these gatherings where she would sing. And he would say, why are you going over there to listen to, establish the prayer and give zakat and this and that? Instead, come and hang out with us, and we're going to have a great time and have some fun. So he would, يشتري لهو الحديث, he would be using this form of entertainment to ليضل عن سبيل الله, to guide people or to misguide people away from the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And some of the scholars, they say that this verse is an evidence for the prohibition of music, for example. If you look at the scholars who cite the prohibition of music, they'll often cite this specific verse, and the mufassirun will say لهو الحديث is referring to the prohibition of music in this particular case. And what this verse is talking about is anyone who uses entertainment as a way to misguide people away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it doesn't always have to be something that's explicitly evil in its nature, but it's used with the intention of moving people away from the call of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I want us to just think critically here about what are the things potentially in our lives that are sort of like idle activities that distract you away from the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And these are things that could potentially fall under this category of lahu al-hadith. And it says, yashtari lahu al-hadith, they purchase this idle speech. And this purchasing, it could be literal or it could be sort of like metaphorical. Like elsewhere in the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أُولَٰئِكَ الَّذِينَ اشْتَرَوُا الْحَيَاةَ الدُّنْيَا بِالْآخِرَةِ. They are those who purchased the worldly life in exchange for the afterlife. Right? So this isn't a literal purchasing, but it means that you've given preference over, or you've chosen one thing over the other. So this is how the surah starts. It starts by talking about the believers who follow the guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then those who use worldly entertainment and distractions to call people away from the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I think the theme that it sort of emphasizes here is, who do you take advice from and follow, right? Are you going to follow the guidance that comes through the messenger, through the prophets, the guidance that is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Or are you going to follow this type of distractions and these types of things that are trying to pull you away and pull you in another direction? So after there's a SUV. What color? Okay, gray SUV. The brother's coming, inshallah. So after the set of this introduction, then there's verses that talk about the magnificence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's creation. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks, this is the creation of Allah, so how can people worship what is other than Him? Rather, these people are clearly astray. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He mentions Luqman. And when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions Luqman, he mentions wisdom. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, when He introduces Luqman to us in the Quran, He says, وَلَقَدْ آتَيْنَا لُقْمَانَ الْحِكْمَةَ أَنِ اشْكُرْ لِلَّهِ وَمَنْ يَشْكُرْ فَإِنَّمَا يَشْكُرُ لِنَفْسِهِ وَمَنْ كَفَرَ فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ غَنِيٌّ حَمِيدٌ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَقَدْ آتَيْنَا لُقْمَانَ الْحِكْمَةَ أَنِ اشْكُرْ لِلَّهِ. And we blessed Luqman with hikmah, with wisdom. Allah is saying He blessed Luqman with wisdom, and ishkur lillah. And we said to him, or we commanded to him, to be grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the quality of wisdom is associated directly with his gratitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And of course, here when he says anishkur lillah, because Luqman, according to the majority of the scholars, he was not a prophet of Allah, but this could be a sort of inspiration that was given to him, through dreams or other than that. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here, he connects wisdom and gratitude. So we can understand from this that if a person has wisdom, wisdom is to recognize the favors of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to turn in gratitude as a response to that. And this is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala connects the quality of wisdom directly to gratitude. And this is gratitude in general. Like if you look at someone who is wise, who knows how to deal with people, and he's socially very intelligent, you'll see that this person is generally very appreciative of the people around him, and he gives them praise and he gives them thanks for the things that they do to him, right? So he's someone who recognizes the favors of other people that upon him. Rather, compare that to someone else who, you could do something good for them or not, it doesn't matter. They don't even realize that you even did anything, right? So this wisdom here is connected to a person's gratefulness, and of course to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, recognizing the favors that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has bestowed upon a person. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, after He mentions the wisdom of Luqman and that he was told to be grateful to Allah, وَمَنْ يَشْكُرْ فَإِنَّمَا يَشْكُرُ لِنَفْسِهِ وَمَنْ كَفَرَ فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ غَنِيٌّ حَمِيدٌ. And whoever is grateful at the end of the day is only grateful for himself, meaning it only benefits himself, and Allah is free from any need from His creation. But this is something that is for himself. And then afterwards, we get into the actual advice of Luqman towards his child. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, وَإِذْ قَالَ لُقْمَانُ لِابْنِهِ وَهُوَ يَعِظُهُ يَا بُنَيَّ لَا تُشْرِكْ بِاللَّهِ إِنَّ الشِّرْكَ لَظُلْمٌ عَظِيمٌ. And remember when Luqman told his child, when he was advising him, do not associate partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Indeed, associating partners is one of the worst of all crimes that a person can do. And if we think about what did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala enjoin upon Luqman, He enjoined upon him to be grateful or to show gratitude, shukr lillah. And kufr is the ultimate ingratitude towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So his advice to his children is to not associate partners with Allah. Associating partners with Allah is not recognizing the favors of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon you and instead attributing them to other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So there's like sort of like a connection here between that quality of gratitude and his most important advice to his child. The first thing that he mentions and the first thing that should be pertinent to all of us is the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. And then afterwards, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the verse right after this gives us His own advice to mankind. So He starts with the advice of Luqman to his child. Then Allah gives us His own advice to mankind. And then the verses continue with Luqman's advice to his child. The second verse right after the first, وَوَصَّيْنَا الْإِنسَانَ بِوَالِدَيْهِ حَمَلَتْهُ أُمُّهُ وَهْنًا عَلَى وَهْنٍ وَفِصَالُهُ فِي عَامَيْنِ أَنِ اشْكُرْ لِي وَلِوَالِدَيْكَ إِلَيَّ الْمَصِيرُ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَوَصَّيْنَا الْإِنسَانَ, and we advise mankind. So Luqman is advising his son, right, to worship Allah alone. And then immediately after that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sort of interjects and within this sequence of Luqman's advice, but Allah interjects and says, and we advised mankind, meaning after the worship of Allah, the second most important thing, and there's elsewhere in the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, worship Allah alone and be good to the parents. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala interjects here and says, and we advised not just the believers, mankind, we advised mankind, وَوَصَّيْنَا الْإِنسَانَ بِوَالِدَيْهِ, with good treatment to their parents. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions the mother. And the scholars, they say that Allah mentions the mother first because the mother has a greater sacrifice towards the care of the child. حَمَلَتْهُ أُمُّهُ وَهْنًا عَلَى وَهْنٍ وَفِصَالُهُ فِي عَامَيْنِ أَنِ اشْكُرْ لِي وَلِوَالِدَيْكَ إِلَيَّ الْمَصِيرُ. Be grateful to me and to your parents. We're coming back to the concept of gratitude, recognizing the favors that others have upon you. So the first was recognizing the favors of Allah and turning to Him in worship alone. The second is recognizing the favors that your parents have upon you and to turn to them with gratitude and to turn to them with good behavior and obedience, except the one situation if they call you to the disobedience of your Creator, right? And this is the second verse immediately after that, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَإِن جَاهَدَاكَ عَلَىٰ أَن تُشْرِكَ بِمَا لَيْسَ لَكَ بِهِ عِلْمٍ فَلَا تُطِعْهُمَا وَصَاحِبْهُمَا فِي الدُّنْيَا مَعْرُوفًا وَاتَّبِعْ سَبِيلَ مَنْ أَنَابَ إِلَيَّ ثُمَّ إِلَيَّ مَرْجِعُكُمْ فَأُنَبِّئُكُمْ بِمَا كُنْتُمْ تَعْمَلُونَ. That means unless if they call you to worship other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then do not follow them in this. And why is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala making this a point to say? Two things. It means everything other than that, everything that doesn't contain disobedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there's an implicit expectation here that this is something that you obey them in and you follow them in. Meaning that if they're calling you, there's something that they're asking you to do for them, even if it's difficult upon you, they have a fadl over you. And you have to fulfill that right that they have upon you, except if it's disobedience to Allah. And even if they're calling you to worship other than Allah, does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say, throw them away, don't answer them, cut them off, and go a different path and pick a different... No, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَلَا تُطِعْهُمَا, do not follow them, وَصَاحِبْهُمَا فِي الدُّنْيَا مَعْرُوفًا. Yet you still have to be a pleasant companion to them in this world. Meaning you still deal with them with kindness, you still deal with them with softness. And this is if they're calling you to worship other than Allah. So imagine if other than that, like if you still have to maintain good character, good adab, good companionship with your parents, even if they're calling you to worship other than Allah, you don't follow them in that, right? But I'm still going to treat you with respect. So imagine then if your parents are not calling you towards the disobedience to Allah, and yet we have sometimes bad attitude, ingratitude towards our parents, and we don't show them the gratitude that they deserve from us. So this is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is then warning us about. And then we go back to the verses of Luqman, where he says, يَا بُنَيَّ إِنَّهَا إِن تَكُ مِثْقَالَ حَبَّةٍ مِّنْ خَرْدَلٍ فَتَكُنْ فِي صَخْرَةٍ أَوْ فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ أَوْ فِي الْأَرْضِ يَأْتِ بِهَا اللَّهُ إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَطِيفٌ خَبِيرٌ. This talks about the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that even if there's the smallest weight of a seed in the depths of the earth, and deep in the rocks in the depths of the earth, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can bring it forward, and He is knowledgeable of it. Meaning that there isn't the smallest action that you can do that will go unnoticed. You wouldn't be called to account by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then just kind of picking up the pace a bit due to time, the next piece of advice, he talks about now the acts of worship that he's calling his child to. يَا بُنَيَّ أَقِمِ الصَّلَاةِ وَأْمُرْ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَانْهَ عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ وَاصْبِرْ عَلَى مَا أَصَابَكَ إِنَّ ذَلِكَ مِنْ عَزْمِ الْأُمُورِ. He's now enjoining, he's advising his children, his child, and he says, أَقِمِ الصَّلَاةِ, establish the prayer. So we understand from this set of verses like a sense of prioritization. One was worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. Two was like, making sure that no matter what, we treat our parents with respect. Three, he's saying establish the prayer. And he's not saying fulfill the prayer. He's saying establish the prayer. And this is elsewhere in the Quran itself. And there's an intention behind this. And the meaning of this is that the prayer isn't something that's simply done for the sake of completing it. But to establish the prayer is to give it its right regard in your life. Meaning allocating the time for the prayer. Allocating, focusing your attention when you come to stand before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with a sense of humble submissiveness. All of this comes in the iqamah of the prayer itself, and not just someone who does it. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَأْمُرْ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَانْهَ عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ. So after you establish the prayer and you're focusing on your own personal righteousness, the next step to that is you also have to call other people towards good. And what was the critical mistake of like Bani Israel? Even the people who would be righteous, they wouldn't do this. They wouldn't enjoin what is good and forbid what is evil. And we get that story in Surah Al-Baqarah, for example, with the fishing community who would not do this, and they were ultimately punished. So Islam as a religion, it calls to the rectification of society as a whole. But before you could advise others, you have to invest in yourself. So it's أقم الصلاة وأمر بالمعروف وانهى عن المنكر. And then once you do these things, inevitably harm will come your way. When you call people to do what is good and to forbid what is evil, harm will come your way. And that's why وَاصْبِرْ عَلَى مَا أَصَابَكَ. What's the evidence for this? All of the prophets that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has sent. Every prophet that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent, the people opposed him. What was he doing? He was enjoining what is good and forbidding what is evil. And the people opposed them, they drove them out, they killed some of them. So inevitably when you try to do this in your life, you will see some harm or some opposition as a result. And this is why وَاصْبِرْ عَلَى مَا أَصَابَكَ. Be patient over what befalls you. And this is from the greatest of matters. And then the very last 2 points is just more related to your dealings with the people. So in order for your da'wah to be successful and received, is you have to deal with people with humility, with love, with compassion, and that's why the last two advices are around that. وَلَا تُصَعِّرْ خَدَّكَ لِلنَّاسِ وَلَا تَمْشِ فِي الْأَرْضِ مَرَحًا إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُحِبُّ كُلَّ مُخْتَالٍ فَخُورٍ. That means do not turn your nose up to the people and walk pridefully on the earth. Allah doesn't love an arrogant, boastful person. So, how are you going to enjoin what is good, forbid what is evil, and then you deal with people with arrogance and, in a boastful way? Nobody's going to accept anything from you. So you have to deal with people with humility. واقصد في مشيك واغضض من صوتك إن أنكر الأصوات لصوت الحمير. And be moderate in your pace in the way that you walk, and lower your voice. The ugliest of voices is the braying of the donkeys. So this is now like your own, the way that you carry yourself. So you deal with the people in a way that is humble, and then also the way that you carry yourself is in a way that is that shows self-respect, and not someone who is loud and boastful and just those ugly qualities that turn people away. And then after this set of verses that we just mentioned, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala goes back to reminding mankind the favors that He has bestowed upon mankind, and it sort of becomes like a cycle. So wisdom essentially is recognizing the favors that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has bestowed upon you, turning to Him in worship alone, and then of course the set of verses that talk about the rectification of a person and establishing the prayer in his personal life, and then it comes back to the same cycle of remembering the favors of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon them. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us of those who are grateful. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us of those who turn to Him in remembrance. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive us for our sins and our shortcomings. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to guide us to that which pleases Him and make us from His righteous servants. وصلى اللهم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Turn that off? Did I? Yes. The mic. Should I leave it on?